Last week we covered tama', which was covetous desire. And then what he says in there, rahimahullah, Shaykh Muhammad Mawlud bin Ahmed Farid Yaqubi al-Musawi, what he says is وَسُمُّهَ السَّاعِي تَطْوِيلَ الْأَمَلِ فَوْطِينُكَ النَّفْسَ عَلَى بُعْدَ الْأَجَلِ. He says that the Arabs have they call it summu sa'a, which is a poison that acts immediately, quick acting, immediate acting poison. The immediate acting poison of this love of dunya and tama' and all the diseases of the heart is tatwil al-amal. And then he gives us a definition of it, which is accustoming or assuring yourself that death is a long way off. And this is something, obviously, on the one hand, it's a necessary human condition. And there's an amazing wisdom in tatwil al-amal. And one of the wisdoms that the ulama have mentioned about tatwil al-amal is that if people did not have extended hope, they wouldn't bother planting trees. I mean, if you thought you were going to die any minute, you're not really going to be worrying about farming or having children, and so what would happen is there'd be no infrastructure for the next generation. Every generation would have to come and deal with the immediate circumstances. But instead, because human beings do have hopes that they're going to live, they build things, they farm, right? They create infrastructure, and that infrastructure is inherited by the next generation. And the famous story that in one of the Persian stories is about the Persian Shah who passed by an old man planting an olive tree, and the king said, وَهَلْ تَنْفَعُكَ هَذِهِ الشَّجَرَةِ وَسَتَمُوتُ قَبْلَ أَن تُدْرِكَهَا. Is this tree going to be of any benefit for you? Because you'll die surely before it comes to fruition, because a good olive tree takes several decades before it really is producing good olives. And so the Shaykh said, and it became a proverb amongst the Arabs, زَرَعُوا قَبْلَنَا فَأَكَلْنَا فَنَحْنُ نَزْرَعُ حَتَّى يَأْكُلُوا. They planted before us, and we ate from what they planted. And so we plant so that those coming after us will eat. So the king gave him a reward, and then he said, already the tree benefited me. And so he gave him more. So the idea of this tatwil al-amal is that it's a necessary, it's a rahmah from Allah, that Allah has put this in. Because people wouldn't go to school, people wouldn't do anything. Now, one of the things about modern society is because of the apocalyptic nature of the age we're living in, people are beginning to lose hope about the future. A lot of young people are becoming very nihilistic, dressing in black, right, at these schools and things like this. There's a morbid perspective on the world. And the fast food culture, which is the idea of, get it now, don't wait. And the credit culture is a culture that really is causing people to lose this sense that there is a future. And in fact, it's only recently, this is the first generation of Americans that actually see that their future will be worse than their parents. Prior to that, Americans were noted for their cheery optimism about the future. And they're losing that. Right? And so it's actually a bad sign when people do lose hope. On the other hand, what he's saying is that it's also a deadly poison. If you have too much hope, it becomes a false hope, an amal, ul al-amal. And the result of it is that it generates hard-heartedness and indolence. So he says, يُرْهِثُ قَسْوَةَ الْقُلُوبِ وَالْكَسَلِ. What that means is, by tul al-amal, the heart becomes hard because it doesn't reflect on akhirah, it doesn't reflect on its own mortality, on its own dependence. And so it gets a hard heart. Now, Al-Fudayl ibn Iyad radiallahu anhu said, and he's one of the great early scholars and zuhad, the people of asceticism or of doing without. He said, خَمْسٌ مِنْ عَلَامَةِ الشَّقَاء. There's 5 things that are signs of shaqa, which is wretchedness. The world is divided into 2 types of people. Sa'id and Shaqi. There's only 2 types. That's it. No third. Sa'id and Shaqi. Sa'id is felicitous. And Shaqi is wretched. And the idea is obviously, now, if you look at Aristotle, who's kind of foundational to Western civilization, Aristotle wrote a book called The Ethics. And in this book, he basically says the goal in life is leisure and happiness. And this is reflected in the Declaration of Independence. Because the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson, he says in there that people have these inalienable rights from God, given to them. And he says among which are life, haya, haqqul haya, liberty, hurriya. These are Sharia rights as well. But then he says, and the pursuit of happiness. Right? In his original wording, he actually said the right to be free of debt when you come into the world. Right? Because what happens now is that, like, because of national debt, children are born in debt. I think it's about $50,000 in debt. Like, every child that's born is automatically in debt based on their previous generation's overspending. So, that was the original phrase, but then he changed it to the pursuit of happiness. Now, what is happiness to a middle-aged, white landowner in 1776? Having more land. So their idea of happiness really was the pursuit of stuff, of goods. And this is part and parcel of the modern American dream. Happiness is seen as pursuing stuff. What Islam did is it radically altered human beings' understanding of what happiness is. Happiness is not necessarily a quote-unquote good life. According to the Muslims, happiness is sa'ada in the next world. If you're sa'id in the next world, it doesn't matter how you lived your life in this world. And the previous class, when we were looking at the seerah, the dua of the Prophet ﷺ, when he said, if you're not angry with me, then I don't care what you do with me. In other words, if my life is miserable in this world, but I haven't incurred your wrath, I'm happy with that. Because he knows that the akhirah, خَيْرٌ لَكَ مِنَ الْأُولَى, the end world, the afterlife, is better than the first life. So, anyway, the opposite concept of shaqawa is sa'ada, felicitousness, is shaqawa. Shaqawa is the idea of, in the next world, the person doesn't have akhirah. They're shaqi. That's what it means. So Fudayl ibn Iyad said that there were 5 signs of shaqawa. The first one was qaswat al-qalb, a hard heart. That's a sign a person's shaqi. And the Prophet ﷺ said to a man who saw him kiss a baby, he said, أَتُقَبِّلُ أَوْلَادَكَ? He said, نَعَمْ أُقَبِّلُ أَوْلَادِي. I kiss my children. He said, عندي 10 أولاد ما قبلت واحدا منهم. I have 10 children, I never kissed one from them. And that's the ghilva, it's a pride in being a tough Arab. And the Prophet ﷺ said, لا أملك شيئا في ديني لمن نزع الله من قلبه الرحمة. I don't have anything in my deen for a man who Allah has removed rahmah from his heart. So hard-hearted it means that you don't have a portion of the deen. Right? إِرْحَمُوا مَنْ فِي الْأَرْضِ يَرْحَمْكُمْ مَنْ فِي السَّمَاءِ. Have mercy on those in the earth, and He in the heavens will have mercy on you. So, قَسْوَةُ الْقَلْبِ, جُمُودَ الْعَيْنِ. the eye that doesn't weep. And the ulama say, if you want to know whether your heart is hard, then look at your eye. Because if the eye is dry, it's an indication of a hard heart. Right? So the person who has riqqa in the heart has a wet eye, and the person who doesn't has a hard heart. And the next is qillatul haya, lacking modesty. People that don't have shame. إِذَا لَمْ تَسْتَحِي فَاصْنَعْ مَا شِئْتَ مِنْ كَلَامِ النُّبُوَّةِ الْأُولَى, from the words of first prophecy. If you have no shame, do whatever you want. If you don't have shame, do what you want. So qillatul haya is a sign of shaqawa. الرغبة في الدنيا, desiring dunya, is a sign of shaqawa. Because they say that no one increases in his akhirah except that it harms his dunya. And no one increases in his dunya except that it harms his akhirah. By the nature, because they're two opposites. So increase in one is decrease in the other. Now this does not mean wealthy people automatically you assume that, there's a famous story, it's a story. It's like a teaching story. I mean, it doesn't, there's a famous story, it's a Moroccan story, right? About, there was a Zahid who heard about this Shaykh who had, that he was a big wali of Allah. And so he wanted to go see him. And he came down from the mountain, he was riding his lion. And he gets there, and the Shaykh lives in a big palace. And he said, this is so-and-so's house? And he's shocked because he lives up in a cave. And then the Shaykh comes out, and he says, where can I put my lion? He said, put him in my barn with my cow. He said, no, he'll eat the cow. He said, no, just put him in the barn with the cow. So he puts him in the barn with the cow. Then they have this big dinner, and the Shaykh eats a few bites, and he says, Astaghfirullah. This is so luxurious. He said, I live on water and dates. And then that night, the Shaykh goes to sleep. The Zahid stays up all night praying, and he hears the Shaykh snoring next door. He's completely shocked about it. He decides the next morning after Fajr, he's just leaving. So he goes to get his lion. He goes in, and the cow ate the lion. So he says to the man, where's my lion? He said, your lion's just like you. It's all outward. You see. And he said, and you thought my cow was a harmless cow, but he was a lion inside. Anyway, the point of that story is, you have to be very careful because outward appearances can fool people, right? And Sidi Ahmed Zarruq says an amazing thing. Well, we'll get to that when we get to having a bad opinion of people. So anyway, and the last one is طول الأمل. So those 5 things are a sign of hardness of the heart. And what this science is about is bringing life to the heart. And one of the interesting things in Nur al-Yaqeen, which is the seerah by an Egyptian scholar, one of the things that he mentioned in there was how the Sahaba many of them lost all of their dunya. And he says in there, but he said their concern was not, and he talked about the first masjid built at Quba, and said this was a simple masjid. In fact, he said a Muslim now would not recognize it as a masjid. And he said, because now we've become obsessed with ornamenting our outward appearance. And he said, and our inwards are bereft. He said the Sahaba were the opposite. They had no concern for the beautification of the outward. They were only concerned with the purification of their hearts. And there's a big difference, right, on that emphasis. And so what he's saying is that طول الأمل will generate hard-heartedness and indolence regarding obligations, which leads to inroads into the prohibited. What that means is, kasal is this indolence. It's a lack of energy to do things. Now, interestingly enough, there will be people who have incredible energy when it comes to dunya things. When it comes to akhirah, they have no energy at all. In fact, people say, I really can't pray. I work so hard, and I get home and I'm really tired and I just fall asleep, and I'd like to pray, but I don't have time. There are people really that literally say that, quite literally. That's a sign that their heart's dead. Because they have time for things in dunya, and they don't have time for akhirah, which means they really don't believe in akhirah. And one of the things Hasan al-Basri said, I saw 70 men of Badr. He said, if you saw them, you would say madmen. He's talking to the tabi'een. You would say majaneen. He said, if they saw the best of you, they would say, these people have no character. And if they saw the worst of you, they'd say, these people don't believe in the Day of Judgment. So, the belief in akhirah will manifest in the behavior and in the concerns of a human being. The stronger their belief in akhirah, the more they're concerned about their akhirah and how to protect it. Now, if you look on the footnote, there is loss of energy for even obedient actions, and one will begin to convince himself that he is unable to do what he's obliged to do due to his state, and thus it creates inroads into the prohibited. In other words, he'll say, I just can't do it, I'm unable, and that leads to the haram. So, طول الأمل is dangerous. Now, there's a tradition, it's not a hadith, but it's often quoted as a hadith, and the tradition says that اعمل لدنياك كأنك تعيش أبدا وعمل لأخراك كأنك تموت غدا. Act for your dunya as if you'll live forever, and act for your akhirah as if you're going to die tomorrow. Now, Shaykh Uthman Bashir, rahimahullah, a dear friend of mine who lived in Medina most of his life, he was from Eritrea, he told me once, he said, people don't understand that saying. And he said it's always used as a justification for working really hard for dunya. So the dunyawi people love that hadith because they always say, Ya akhi, i'mal li dunyaka ka'annaka ta'ishu abada. He said, if you look at it in the context of work for your dunya as if you'll live forever, but work for your akhirah as if you're going to die tomorrow. He said, if you then look at your situation bifocally, one, your dunya matters, you have forever to take care of them, but your akhirah, you're going to die tomorrow. He said, you're going to start preparing for your akhirah and say, I have plenty of time to take care of my dunya. So it's the opposite kind of understanding that most people have, and that's really the way. Now the other thing is, لَا تَنْسَى نَصِيبَكَ مِنَ الدُّنْيَا. In the Quran, Qarun, don't forget your portion of the dunya. There's two ways that's interpreted. One is, don't forget what Allah has given you in order that you can expend it for akhirah. And the other is, the dunya is there and Allah gave it to you, so don't forget that there is dunya, but the important thing is akhirah. And these are they're both acceptable positions. So we're not anti-worldly, like say for instance traditional Christianity was. We're not against the world. The world is a place Allah made it for us to enjoy as well. But not to enjoy to the point where we forget what we're really here for and that it's a bridge.